Hey dudes, today I want to talk about creating multiple outputs on the same audio track, and I also want to show you how to make a web processed or louder version of the mix that you're working with. So let's jump right into it. All right, so let's just hit play and see what we got. Here is a recording of me talking evenly. There are no real spikes. It's a pretty good example of dialogue speaking at -24 LUFS. Cool, so that pretty much explains what that is. It's just an example recording around -24. So at some point we're going to want to make a web version of this that's louder, and we are using the WLM plus loudness meter from Waves to measure right now, and we will also use that to create the web version. Okay, so let's zoom in over here. So right now you can see this audio track is just going to a stereo output. So it's just going straight to the speakers, but I'm going to want to route it to my different processing tracks here. So if I just hold Control and Shift at the same time, click on the output. I want to go to my bus menu because I'm busing this internally. And I'm going to want to send this to my DX TV proc, so that would be like for TV, streaming, etc. That's my -24. That's how I'm referring to that. But all I did was left click while holding Control and Shift. And then I want to make a web proc version of it. So, or a web version that runs through the web proc is another way to say that. I'm still holding Control and Shift. And then I just left click again. And you got your two yellow checks that's going to let me know that it's now routed to both of those tracks at the same time. So I can let go and just click out of this. And the key function here is that you'll see a little plus sign that's letting me know, or if I hover over it, it'll tell me how many different places it's going to. So good thing I'm double checking my work. This is going to the stereo output and the TV proc and the web proc. We probably don't want that because that's tripling up. No problem. Let's just do it again for practice. Control and Shift, click, and I can just unclick or unhighlight this one and then double check my buses, make sure they're good, click off of it, and there you go. The plus sign's still there. If I hover over it, TV proc, web proc are engaged, good to go. So something that's really important to note when you are working with multiple outputs is making sure that you create some sort of null or dead bus. Basically, you just go to the I/O menu and you create a bus that goes nowhere, and you route at least one of your final outputs to that, and then you can have one of your other final outputs actually go to the speaker. So the reason this is important should be obvious, is just you don't want to double dip. You don't want to have two output sources going to the speakers at the same time, because you're just going to keep adding more and more and more information over everything, and that's no good. So if I play now, you'll see that everything's hitting the meters. Here's a recording of me talking evenly, but it's only coming out of this because this is the stereo output. So I can test this theory by busing this also to the null stereo and hitting play again. You see nothing is coming out, and I can double test this theory by just changing the output of the web final out, and now we should hear it again. Here's a recording of me talking evenly. Cool. So just very important to note before you get too far in this process that you in fact have these null or buses, or I suppose you could also just try to make a dead output or whatever you want, but easy for me just to make a bus that goes to nowhere basically. And so there's no possible way that sound can come out. So let's engage this again. If you want any more help with routing, you can check out some of my other videos to see how this is done. But I'm going to assume you guys are good to go, and we can move on to creating the web version of this file. So let's pick up here. Again, this is the TV final out that's outputting. Here is a recording of me talking evenly. We already measured everything. It was -24 is where we wanted it to be. But now I need to make a louder version of this basically. So I'm going to null this out. Double check nothing is playing. That's what we want. And let's go ahead and then change the output of the web final out. Here is a recording of me. So nothing has changed yet, but I've just changed the source of what we're listening to. And now let's go to the web final out on the insert column and go ahead and look for Waves Audio and WLM Plus. We can do this all through the metering plugin here, and I'll show you the two things that you need to change to make this work. It's pretty easy. So what you should probably always have engaged is this true peak limiter. This is an awesome feature of this plugin. If I click it, it goes orangey and says on. And if I scroll just down to this section here where it says true peak max, this will tell you that the true peak max is -2. Now you will often see this on a spec sheet. It says true peak -2. And what that means is that your true peak will not be 0 or close to the point where you can distort. It'll in fact be 2 dB lower. So the true peak will be -2, which is great. So you always should do this, even if you don't have this plugin. It's just awesome that this plugin has it worked into its system, but you can use any limiter and make sure the ceiling is at -2. Now, the other reason I really love this plugin is I can just do some quick math and I can use this gain slider here to increase the amount of gain that I need to add. Now, if you're using aux tracks, you'll probably, if you're following along, you might have already seen that I put this in the wrong place, but that's always good. We're correcting and checking our work. This is on the final out, so that's a good place where you can measure what you need to measure, but not a good place to do any processing, which is why I like to have DX Web Processing. So it reminds me that in fact I need to have this here. Remember, aux tracks have information pass through them and then land at a new location. So my processing should happen at the processing. It should pass through it, then land on the final out, which is where I will print it. So always double check that if you're using an aux system specifically. You should not put it on where you're printing. You should have a processing aux prior to that moment. As I said before, we just need to do some quick math, and this will be determined on what you need to actually deliver the file at. So for my ears personally, I like a little hybrid system where I do more like -18. Spotify and even places like YouTube, which you are watching this on, thank you for doing that, will ask for sometimes things as loud as 13 or 14. Specifically, Spotify and YouTube will be 14, but I've seen some web refs that say you can be between 13 and 17. That's pretty loud for my ears and not very dynamic. So especially if you're working with something like film where you want to keep your dynamics, for me personally, I've found that -18 is a nice safe zone where we've bumped it up significantly, but we're not entering into just kind of like everything's just crunched to the top and just extremely loud. So up to you, whatever you want to do. And that's what makes this gain slider so fun. You just hit whatever number math you need. So 24 minus 6 would be 18. So I'm going to increase the volume by 6, which of course we're working in negative numbers for the lefts. So it'll go from -24 to -18. So let's test this theory, make sure it works. Of me talking evenly, there are no real spikes. It's a pretty good example of dialogue speaking at -24 LUFS. All right, so not -24 anymore, of course, because we have changed this to be -18. There's our long term. It in fact says that we have reached -18, which is great. And if you're feeling frisky, you can even go down here and change your target, for example, to be -18 so that you get your little green check and it makes you feel like you're doing the job that you need to do. All right, so that's how you create multiple outputs on one track. Now, we use this to create a web processed or louder version of the mix we are working on, but you may use this for whatever you need. Just remember to have some sort of dead bus or null bus because you don't want to double dip on those outputs. It might hurt your ears. It's just going to be loud. It's not going to sound pleasant. It's going to be two sources going to the output or speakers at the same time. So avoid that. Be very careful. Make sure you have something that's null and you flip back and forth between these. But there you go. There's your multiple outputs, and you can use them how you need to in your projects. I hope you learned something, and I hope you had a good time. Until next time, later, dudes.